So we'll be talking about, so the title is Living the Truth, the Trance of Insufficiency. So we're going to explore, taking off from last week where we looked at stories and how stories, believing the stories that we create, that are created in the mind, cause so much of our suffering. This week we're going to look at how this trance of unworthiness or insufficiency or inadequacy that so many people have is kind of based on this story production machine that we have between our ears. So this insufficiency that so many of us feel is based on the common misperception of a separate self, first of all. Right? It's a separate self that feels unworthy or insufficient or inadequate, and seeing that through the stories that we believe. But at its core, this is seeing the sense of inadequacy is based on the stories we believe. They could be personal stories, they could be collective stories. But there's this story that gets woven that is believed. So it's imperative that we become conscious of these stories and see how they create this sense of insufficiency or inadequacy. So in seeing the story, noticing it and seeing the story, the presence of the story, opens a crack in us, and it kind of allows, I'm going to call it the light of love, of abiding love to shine in. And it's this love that both heals our wounds and enables us to move beyond our stories. I'm just going to unpack a little more what I mean by this. Remember, we're talking about living the truth is about closing the gap between the truth that we've realized and the primary truth really is the truth of no self, that there's no separate self, that's an illusion that's believed. So it's closing the gap between that truth that's been realized and how we relate in the world. So if we're seeing the sense of insufficiency and unworthiness arising, then there's a gap here that we can work with and play with. So seeing the stories of insufficiency closes the gap, and it allows what I'll call in this talk abiding love and I'll say more about what that means, to come in, to shine through. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, not so much about the personal stories. We all have our personal stories, right, that may be believed, and if they are, then we can see how they've created suffering, and in this case, a sense of unworthiness. So you can kind of imagine for yourself, well, what stories do I believe that create this sense of unworthiness? They could be stories about your childhood, stories about the way we were treated by our parents growing up, or stories about siblings, interactions with siblings, these kind of stories of neglect, or whatever they might be. They could be stories at workplace, events at workplaces, or with friends, or it could be something you did, or somebody did to you. All these kinds of stories that we've personal stories that we've created. You just kind of think, what can you think of one that you have, a story that you have that you believe to be true that creates a sense of unworthiness. Just kind of let that rest for a little bit. The egoic mind may pipe in and go, well, no, yeah, I got these stories, but they're true. And okay, just go beneath it, what the egoic mind may be coming in with its resistance, and just being with that, saying, okay, yeah, here's a story. It's believed, and it creates suffering, difficulty. And is this underlying a sense of inadequacy, insufficiency that arises? So this is a core wound for many people, a very core wound. And each person has a unique story of experiences that have contributed to this. And these are our personal stories, such as I was a neglected child, I was unloved, I was bullied, so on and so forth. X person always does this. And so you'll see the words of blame also come up with it. So you'll see at the root of all these stories is a common misperception, and that's a misperception of a separate self, right? A separate self that is somehow insufficient or inadequate. So these are really the core stories that we want to look at. Some spiritual teachers talk about kind of the collective story in Western societies. It gives it also a collective sense of insufficiency. And I think people are really trying to figure out why some cultures have this sense so much more than other cultures. And as someone who's traveled and lived in different cultures, I've seen firsthand the differences between cultures in this sense. There's the famous story with the Dalai Lama not being able to understand the whole idea of unworthiness, self-hatred. I think was what it was translated in. Took the translator about half an hour to explain what that meant. It's just not something that's part of the Tibetan culture. There's been the notion that the stories in the East that explain suffering, or where suffering comes from, Buddhism and Hinduism, Taoism, is that what leads to the suffering is our sense of separation, this misperception that we're separate. So it's just a very innocent misunderstanding in a sense. It's kind of very impersonal. And the path out of this is to awaken to your true nature and see that you're actually complete and whole and one. And that your deepest nature transcends your personal psychology or egoic sense of separation. So that's kind of the religious story for the East. It's a very impersonal story. The Western story, the Judeo-Christian story, is quite different. It's kind of rooted in a sense of shame and insufficiency, the notion of original sin. So the kind of cultural stories and myths says that there's something essentially wrong with us. In Genesis, the Adam and Eve offending God by eating the apple, and God inflicts upon us a sense of self-consciousness. So this story has the sense that our human nature is essentially flawed. There's an original essential flaw that's there. So this is a very personal story. And you can see how that story can lead to this sense of inadequacy or insufficiency. We can carry this feeling that there's something deeply wrong. There's an essential flaw, and we're to blame for it in some way. So that's one way to kind of, how some spiritual teachers have addressed the kind of collective nature, because it's something I've really noticed in, as I said, in my exposure to other cultures, is in Canada, United States, Europe, UK. There is a real deep sense of inadequacy and insufficiency that's not present throughout the Eastern cultures. But it's not the one aspect of it that's perhaps confusing for me is the Philippines. It was, for 400 years, the Spanish brought in Christianity, and so it was Christian for 400 years. Now that, but at the same time is also a culture that doesn't have this sense of insufficiency, of inadequacy. It'd be hard pressed to find a Filipino that would really, that was born in the Philippines, that would have that, and was raised in the Philippines, that would have that sense. It's very loving and child-centered and culture. But again, that's a glimpse of, that's 400 years of their history. They have all those thousands of years of history that predates the introduction of Christianity into the Philippines. So that, I don't want to get too theoretical. I'd like to get back a little bit, but it is interesting to kind of look at these different cultural stories as well that can underpin this sense of inadequacy, as well as our personal stories. And the fact that it's so widespread in our society means that there's some kind of collective nature, collective aspect to the stories. I think I've said before, I have yet to meet a meditation student, to have somebody I've worked with, where this hasn't been a core part of what they work with in their meditation practice. I mean, there's a reason why teachers like Tara Brach, continuously talk about this trance of unworthiness. I think there's a reason, and this came up last week, there's a reason that in our society, we have so much emphasis on the self-compassion aspect. Self-compassion wasn't really something the Buddha talked about. He talked about compassion, which includes everything, which includes ourselves, but was never that focusing in on for oneself. And this has been very predominant. In fact, I'm seeing more and more lately, perhaps given the times we're living through, more and more and more emphasis on self-compassion courses and teachings. So I think when we offer, because we really are, when we offer these teachings that come from the East, they're Eastern spiritual teachings, by and large, although we do bring in, as we have here, people like Anthony de Mello and other Christian mystic teachers. When we bring in those kinds of teachings, we have to also address this distinct culture, the distinct cultural factors of the West, of our societies when we do that. So to give a teaching on no self that does not address kind of our core beliefs as a culture isn't enough. It's not enough to dislodge the sense of shame and insufficiency that is so prevalent in our society. So there's something more is called for in teaching for Westerners. And I'm going to call this abiding love. It's often talked about as compassion, but I like the word love. And I'll give you some of the reasons. And perhaps we don't use it so much in the West because I think we have a fairly limited, comparatively limited view of love. We often think of love as, romantic love, falling in love. I love, or loving, maybe the ones closest to us. But there's different dimensions to love, and that's of course sort of where the place from which I'm using the word. I don't know if you've noticed when you get my weekly emails, or if you email me, I tend to, for the most part, end them with I say with love. And I've had some people actually kind of question that and say, well, what do you mean by with love? The only person that says that is like my partner, my kids. It's not, you're just my meditation teacher. I hope you don't think I'm in love with you, or we're, so this is, they get the, because the conception of love is this conception of romantic love. And I'm coming from a completely different kind of love. So it elicits questions, which actually is a teaching in itself. So we use the same word for all different kinds of love, right? You notice that the same word. It's the same word that we use in other cultures. There's often numerous words for the different types of love. Kind of like the Inuit have many names for snow, depending on the nature of the snow, because it's such a central part of their life. Whereas we have to give it an adjective if we want to describe it, the type of snow. In Sanskrit, language of in India, there are over 100 words for love. To just kind of give it the nuanced description. So I'm going to use an adjective. I kind of toyed around with true love, but then I thought, oh boy, that really elicits romantic love. You're my true love. Oh boy, that's so, because I use true heart and true compassion, but I thought, wow. So I'm going to call it abiding love. And it's is the kind of love. It's a unique kind of love. It's not the same as falling in love. It's more synonymous with a grace, just kind of being bestowed like a gift. It's being bestowed by existence. So it's unconditional. It's boundless love. It's a love that forgives everything. It has no limits in that way. So it's characterized by freedom rather than limitation. It's not a love based on clinging or fear or attachment, wanting somebody to be a particular way in order for you to love them. So to be free, we talk about awakening and freedom. To be free when only things are pleasant is not real liberation. Similarly, to love only when the optimal conditions are present is not this unconditional, boundless, abiding love that I'm speaking about. Loving kindness meditation, which we've done, can elicit such love. It inclines our heart towards such love, extending love to everyone, even difficult people in our lives. So the real challenge is to love in this way with all in our lives, with all people, with all beings. So this is really what I'm looking at when I'm talking about how we relate to this deep trance of unworthiness or insufficiency. This kind of love can engender a deep experience of healing. Reminds you of your essence, your original condition, your love itself. So it can heal our sense of insufficiency, inadequacy, unworthiness. So our feeling of unworthiness is based on believing a story. Right? We talked last week about the state of no problem. Problems are created when we believe stories. So it's imperative that this may sound similar to last week. I'm kind of coming at it from a different angle, but it is similar. It's imperative that we become conscious of these stories, whether they be personal or collective stories. Cultural stories, religious stories, personal stories. So the personal stories are the events of our lives, based on the events in our lives. So we have the events in our lives, and then there are stories that we tell ourselves about those events. Quite two different things, right? So becoming aware of the stories that we've created. And it's imperative that we become aware of these stories that we're living by. Because if we're not aware of the stories that are really underpinning our beliefs and our actions, then we're really kind of living unconsciously. We're just kind of living on autopilot at the whim of conditioning and the stories that we tell ourselves. We're living on autopilot. An example of a story, for example, you may have been bitten by a dog in childhood. So you develop a story around it. You might become scared of all dogs, become frightened whenever you're in the company of a dog. If we pay attention, we realize that we have developed a story in the mind about an entire species based on one event. So we can become conscious of that. We're realizing that the stories are dictating how we're feeling and how we move through life. So you can't close the gap if you're living on autopilot. If we're living unconscious of the stories that are dictating our behavior. So first step is to identify and become aware of the stories. So whenever a sense of unworthiness arises, ask yourself, what story is behind this? What's the story, the believed story? What's the believed story? just asking that question has a powerful impact on what happens next. Because rather than just acting out the beliefs of base that the story feeds, the Papancha, to use a Buddhist term, we're now acting from a place of consciousness and further clarity. So you're simply just bringing the story to awareness. Sounds so simple, right? So powerful. You can ask also, take that a step further, do I really know, and we've talked about this, do I really know that this story is true? And how can I absolutely know that this story is true? Whatever happened may be factual, right? The event may have happened, but really look at the story that you construct around it, and how you'll see how the stories that you hold on to create a deep sense of unworthiness. So we're not trying to deny what happened or make excuses for what happened. We're seeing the truth of the story that we've created around it and how this is causing us suffering. And so that simple act of noticing, becoming aware of the story, asking yourself if it's true. How can you know that it's true in the present moment? How can I know that this is true? Provides the opportunity to reframe and heal and move forward. And this in itself opens us to abiding love. The abiding love can enter through the cracks in our stories. You see this in people when they're letting go of their stories. Often people, when they're about to die, will let go of their stories because they're out of time. They're just out of time, and holding on to the story loses any sense of truthfulness or reality. People acting out of abiding love when they're dying. There's so much healing that can take place as people step out of their stories. And often when the person that's dying steps out of their stories, the people around them can also do the same. And you can see a lot of healing and abiding love flow into these situations. So the invitation is to run out of time now. As if your time is up. Why wait till the time of death to see the truth, the untruth of your stories? Why not see it now and enjoy the abiding love that can shine through the crack? So we're seeing the truth, the untruth of our stories. We're opening to something beyond ourselves, allowing this power to kind of bring light into these dark places. I just love this Leonard Cohen's anthem, that song. And there's the chorus: ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Yeah, that's how the light gets in. It's exactly the image that's the abiding love that shines through the crack. And the crack forms when we see through our stories. Just gives a little crack. a lot of light can come through a little crack, right? A lot of love. So we're seeing, understanding this truth. And I like that, Thich Nhat Hanh is another one who writes often about love, and uses love in a similar way that I'm using it. He talks about how we apply this understanding to other people, but seeing other people living their stories as well, and understanding that, right? You start to see, oh, I'm living from these stories. Oh, so is this other person and this person and this person. So Thich Nhat Hanh teaches that understanding is love's other name. So to truly love means to understand other people's suffering, that they're also living by these stories. This opens our heart. So I'll just end by saying that abiding love, this unconditional, boundless love, is inherent within each of us. We can do loving kindness meditation to incline the mind in that way, but ultimately this is inherent within us. It's not something we have to create or construct. It's something we just have to get in touch with. It may be latent, but it's there. It's inherent in us. It's inherent in existence itself. And when we can touch into this, or it can shine through the cracks, we experience a deep sense of wholeness and forgivingness. So it's this place of our deepest wounding. We've explored this before. The place of our deepest wounding. It's the portal through which we can connect with this love. I'll just end by saying a sense of inadequacy can only make you feel separate and divided, whereas abiding love has the capacity to see through this illusion of inadequacy and to dissolve it. So I hope you found that. I'll open it up to any questions or comments, sharing about your experience with practicing with this. We've all had experience practicing with this sense of insufficiency. It's something I still practice with. I mentioned, at the 3-week retreat I went to, the sense of wanting to be special arising, and that's a way of covering over a subtle sense of inadequacy. That I was going to meditate the longest, be the last one to go to bed at night, and it's going to, and so I noticed that this story arising that was believed, that was keeping me just sitting just out of this sense of, based on the sense of inadequacy. So I thought, oh, there's a story. And as soon as I saw the story, just the competition ended. Because it was just seen for what it was. It was just, isn't that interesting that's arising? And I just kind of saw it for what it was, as a believed story, and then was allowed to sit or not sit and be fine either way. Yeah, so I'm open to any comments or questions or whatever's on your mind. Yeah.
Thank you. Everything resonated as usual. So as you're talking, I'm thinking about my story, which I think most people already know by now, which is I'm a bad person. And I was thinking about how I'm constantly looking for evidence for that. So once in a while, I'll be like, oh, Stephen said I'm not a bad person. I'm not a bad person, for as an example. But then my brain will constantly look for, remember that time when you were a teenager, or, but I have bad thoughts. So I'm constantly trying to, it seems, find evidence that I'm, a bad person. So I'm seeing that now, and I'm giving myself grace for that. But I have two questions, which you answered one of them already. But the first question was, I know you said the ego was always trying to figure it out. Like, where did that story come from? Oh, it must be because of the conditioning or the childhood or this or that or the other. My first question is, does it matter at the end of the day? I mean, a story is a story. Does it matter what the origin was, whether it be childhood trauma or social conditioning or whatever it is? And the second question, which you answered actually, I had was, once we connect to that abiding love, is it done? Are we good? Are we just good? But you kind of answered that, where you still have experiences, but you see them versus grasping onto them and suffering like you used to. So you answered that. But yeah, the first one is, does it really matter what the origin of the stories are? Because that's what my cerebral brain, as you know, is constantly trying to do. But in Lebanon or in Samoa or whatever place that I live, that happened. And maybe this story is actually based on something that's legitimate. So that's, I guess, my question for now. Thank you.
Yeah. Just to go to what your one of your first statements, how the mind scans for events from the past to look for confirmation for a storyline or a belief. Like in your case, I'm a bad person. So mine's constantly, it can scan all the past and find all these instances that proves that story, and can actually see instances where you're actually a really good person, but then it can have a way of to discount it. Right. Well, yeah, but you really, there's kind of this real rationale, or the underlying motivation was actually from a bad person, even though it looked like it was so it's just the mind's just constantly scanning for to confirm this deep wound that is present. The first question, in an ultimate sense, nothing matters.
Right. Okay.
It's really, so I'm trying to think of which teacher had a talk. The title of the talk was "Nothing Matters," and got people's attention. But that's, in an ultimate sense, nothing matters. The stories don't matter. The stories chain us to the past. So really, letting go of the stories simply breaks this chain, allows it to dissolve. Yeah. And I think, when you can really see the untruthfulness of the stories that you've believed for so long, that will really open a crack to let the light in, as Leonard Cohen speaks about. To just you really see ask the question, true, is how can I know this is absolutely true? And who would I be if I didn't believe this story? What has believing this story, where's it gotten me? A lot of suffering. So seeing the truth of the suffering that the story has gotten you, and where would I be without this story? It's Four Noble Truths, right? And in other words, can really open up that crack, or in the sense of our series of talks, really close that gap between what we know is true, but what is still playing out in our lives. Closing that gap between the two.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. When you said that, nothing matters. Now, living in a society amongst the human beings, there is a constant nitpicking, I should say. It does matter, I'm told, by the people around. Yes, it does matter. And yes, you're bad. This constant sort of bombardment by the society, by the social circle, it really makes it very difficult to see, to come apart from this one. Whether it is my own stories, what happened before, I know those are the stories and the truth is different. Whereas on a constant basis, it is hard to ignore, I should say. That's a difficult struggle. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, in a sense, we're bringing sanity to an insane world. Right? We're running around believing we're all separate, which can perhaps be the definition of insanity in this instance. It's the misperception of who we actually are, which creates all kinds of chaos and conflict and division. And we're living amongst that with the truth, knowing the truth of non-separation. So all we can do is live our truth, live the truth of the truth we know of non-separation in the very chaotic and divided world. I don't know that there's an answer beyond that, Om, to that question, unless somebody else has something to add.
No, you said it right. It is just of a constant struggle, and so it's a hard way in this chaotic world, as you said, to isolate oneself and then remind oneself that that is the truth and not the stories. Yes, yeah, it is hard. That's all I can say. Yeah. Thanks.
We can also remind ourselves that we're all one, and everything is perfect the way it is. Everything is unfolding the only way that it can unfold. It's simply one unfolding. And that I remind myself of that quite often. And then I often have to remind myself to live the unknown mystery of it all. Because you could say, okay, we're one, everything's perfect the way it is, and why is it this way? Why is existence this way? So of course it's unknown. It's a mystery why existence is unfolding the way it is, with the apparent what we see as problems. Maureen?
Yeah, I have trouble with accepting that things are unfolding the way they should when I look around at the war, the hunger, the suffering. I mean, we're so privileged here. We're not in the majority, and so many people have desperate lives, and I find that hard to accept, that that things just are unfolding the way that things are the only way they could be, or the only way they should be. I'd like to see things different than that. Yeah.
Yeah, and we've talked about this, in terms of living in the relative world from the truth. That will be a topic that we take up again. And we had this session on racism, living in a racialized world. We've had, so we're going to definitely cover those topics in more detail. But it is, if what arises for you, as it has for me in my life, to work for social justice at the relative level, then that's what arises, and that's what gets done, and that's perfect. If it doesn't arise for some people, that doesn't arise. What arises for them is to do something else, to work in a laundromat and talk to people when they come into the laundromat, or to, whatever it might be. It's all ways of expressing our love into the world, and that's all we can do as an individual, manifesting the whole within the whole. It can feel low. You can feel alone, right? And we're going to have a session on that. You can, not lonely, but you can feel alone. Well, one is one, so I guess if you're really feeling the unity with all, and you're feeling oneness, then you're feeling alone by its very definition, because there's only one. But so in that sense, in the ultimate sense, you are alone. But in a relative sense, you can feel like you're alone in this knowing, because there's so much chaos and division in the world.
I just wanted to add one thing. I read a book recently called Humankind. I forget the author's name. It's terrible, and it's back at the library. So and it's translated into English from Dutch. And it is a very hopeful book to read. This person believes in the inherent goodness of people. And in these difficult times, I found that very positive and very hopeful. So I thought I'd mention that. Perhaps some of you have also read it, but yeah, very enjoyable book.
Yeah, Tracy's saying it's debunks research that has fed us the story of humans as inherently bad, inherently flawed. And that's kind of the collective story that I was talking about in a religious sense. But it's actually gone beyond our religious myths and stories to take on other dimensions. So yeah, or to see you use the word inherently kind, inherently love, inherently compassion. That's our true nature. It's the stories and beliefs and attachments, misperceptions that cause us to believe otherwise.
Hi, Stephen. Thanks for a really, I mean, I sound like a broken record every week when I do speak, because I love every week that we have. But thanks again for a wonderful teaching. And I was just going to say, I think when I was listening to Maureen, I was just thinking about, my own conditioning thinks like, oh yeah, I can tell myself this is all a delusion, but there's people suffering all over the place, and I live this comfortable life. And it's I think that's why compassion is really important too. That's why you can't just have the wisdom and say, oh, this is all a delusion, so I can do whatever I want because everything's a delusion. You need the compassion too, because that's actually what our true nature is. Actually be compassionate and try to relieve people's suffering. So but it's still a huge mystery, and I struggle with that too, Maureen, that feeling as well, that thoughts come in that I wish things could be different, for sure. So the one thing that I was going to say that I found useful for myself is, doing this, working with this story, this trance of unworthiness, or trance of, I think what you call it, trance of insufficiency or something, is looking at, bringing those stories to the consciousness. And but it's not really, when I sit with it, it's not really actually about the story that I'm feeling bad. It's not really the story, because it's just a story. And sitting with it, like, and saying like, okay, what's actually going on? Like, what is this actually? And just allowing that to be there. I don't know, it's almost like a form of inquiry or something, I don't know. And then just allowing it to be there, and you actually realize that it's not really about that thing. It's my mind has created this huge web of things that's like become this huge tangle that's really like tying me down. And every time I come into these repetitive stories, and I feel like every time I kind of ask that question, what is this? And, I'm not thinking about it. I just kind of let that go into the meditation and just, let my being fall into it. It kind of, you can kind of, I feel like I can kind of let go a little bit of the story, or a little bit of the part of the story, and get to maybe like more of a fundamental level of what my true nature is, that it's actually this abiding love, this real compassion for myself and for others. So I don't know if I feel like that practice is okay, like to say like, okay, what is this? And then just leave it. I'm just wondering if you might have any similar practices you might recommend, kind of those forms of inquiry that might be helpful when you're working with these kind of really deeply rooted stories. Thank you.
Yeah, you're simply seeing the story, right? Not arguing with the story. So it's not about trying to disprove or come up with a better story or an opposite story, or the story that I'm a good person or whatever it might be. So it's not about arguing with the story. It's simply seeing it as a story, seeing the story. It's the seeing that's freeing, right, in itself. The seeing is freeing. The inquiry could go to, how do I know that this is absolutely true? And where's the story? who would I be without this story? Could be an interesting inquiry, but beyond that, I wouldn't get to, because you don't want to get into arguing with, then the ego gets involved, right? It's the ego that's perpetuating it. So the ego, all it will do is come up with another story. And the egoic mind will gravitate towards that quite quickly. So it's again being aware if that's happening as well. So just seeing, and very light inquiry, I would say, very light, very soft, gentle inquiry. Not looking for evidence for or against the story, which is again arguing with the story. Simply seeing it, perhaps, and then those two questions that I mentioned, perhaps going that far in terms of inquiry, but I wouldn't go any further than that. I hope that's helpful. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful.
I guess I had a couple thoughts. One was just to touch on what you said, Stephen, about seeing it. I was kind of wondering whether it's the equivalent of dealing with emotions, where you just, rather than try to push them away, you just sort of sit with them and be with them. So see, so that's that's one technique I was thinking. But I also find with whether it's seeing the story or sitting with the emotion, there always seems to be this kind of meta critic out there. It's like something who's like critical of the story as well, right? And so because I sit there and have many stories, and even though I'm the center of attention in the story, I'm still critical of it, right? Because I still have my inner critic. And I guess that's what we're talking about, right? Is being a critic of oneself and judging oneself. I have a hard time leaving that role aside. But I like the idea of just maybe trying to lightly see it. And
Yeah. Thanks, Carl. That's right on. The meta critic. So the story arises. They could have this is I guess the spiritual person's thing, right? I come to this Thursday night group. I meditate every morning. Why am I having these stories come up again and again? Like this shouldn't be happening, So that's part that can, judging the fact that the stories exist, and and then the criticizing. I'm so inadequate because I keep having these stories about being inadequate. So I can, the kind of a spiritual person's thing. It's another layer, right, that we can bring to it because we're somehow doing this practice, which means we shouldn't have, there shouldn't have this gap. Shouldn't have this gap between what we know is true and what arises in our lives. But of course, that's not how life's unfolding. If it was unfolding that way, it would be different. Life only unfolds the way that it can unfold.
Yeah. The other thing that I was at a Dharma talk on last Sunday night, and the person giving the Dharma talk talked about telling himself when he was encountering, people that were problematic. As he kept on, he would tell himself not to one, which is what you were talking about. Like, if we're all just one thing, So his little mantra to himself was not to one. Just a little sharing there.
Yeah, sometimes those little those little mantras, as you called it, these phrases can remind us to see the story as it is, as a story. Their stories are often about other people doing something to us, but they can be about us doing something as well. So that's very non-dual, right?
Yeah.
Not
I was
to,
also thinking that a topic could be is that, you know, the issue of guilt, right? And a Buddhist approach to guilt.
yeah.
Which is very Catholic.
Is it? Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're out of time. I thank you all, and to the Christian, is he still here? And I think a few people have left. And I don't know if David M has been here before. If not, welcome, and we hope to see you again. And thanks for everyone for coming. Oh, next week, I won't be here next week. So do we want to do a session without me here again, or cancel a week? Mhm.
I wouldn't
Who,
mind sitting.
yeah. Joanna, are you available or I shouldn't put you on the spot like this? What are you going to say, right?
I can't say no now, Stephen.
No. Not and be a good person, at least. Yeah.
I know exactly. Well, what if I say no? I'm a bad person. Of course I have to say yes. No, I am. Absolutely.
I don't think anyone could do it. Yana did such a good job last time, so
Yeah.
I think she should always be the replacement for Wenda.
Yeah.
Oh, my ego thanks you, Stephen. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm available, I think.
Do you want me to pick a talk, a meditation, or like I did last time? I'll recommend something. Does that sound good?
That's helpful to me as someone facilitating.
Yeah.
I don't know what anyone else wants.
Yeah. I know Tara Brock has done a lot on self-acceptance and, you know, it's the trance of unworthiness. I'd like to maybe keep that theme before we get into, you know, action in the world in terms of dealing with the social justice issues. And I'd like to kind of start that kind of section off while I'm here. So I'll come up with something interesting. Not the same topic, but something a little different. So yeah, so I'll miss you all next week, but at least you'll be able to meditate together and practice together. It's such an important part of this path. Yeah. So take care, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you, Stephen. Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Good
Stephen.
seeing
Good
everybody.
night,
Thank you,
everyone.
Stephen.
Good night.
Bye.
Night.